Hello again, everybody. Hi, this is Scott. I haven't made a video in a little bit, so I'm back with another video on, of course, Japanese swords. I will do other videos on other kinds of swords, which I have too, so I'll have that in the future. But this video is on myths, half-truths, and legends. And yes, I wrote myself some notes because it's hard for me to remember everything. Because over the years of collecting and doing martial arts, I've heard a lot of, myths, half-truths, and legends about swords, and some of which I could dispel from practical experience. Others is from reading a lot of books and just hearing from people firsthand who practice sword martial arts and actual historians, etc. There's a lot of nonsense out there. But of course, I brought examples to show you as well. It's no fun without actual practical examples. All right, so one of the myths you might hear out there and the fancy things about Japanese swords is they are like thousands and thousands of years old. But that's not really true. The Japanese swords in their current form, about the year 1000. Before that, they were pretty straight and modeled on Chinese swords. A lot of what came to Japan was from Chinese or Korean influence. So at first, in Japan, they had straighter, Chinese style swords. It wasn't until a little later that they developed their own style of swords that became, unique. And the other myth is that they stay sharp forever, like they're never dull. They're the sharpest things on the planet, and you can do surgery with it or something. No, it's I mean, they're great weapons, and of course they're legendary, but they're essentially pieces of steel. They don't stay sharp forever. They will dull. They will dull over time. Sometimes just sitting there. So they did have to be, in times of battle and actual use, like sharpened and reshaped on a regular basis. And of course, they get sharper through the polishing and reshaping process. Also, there have been stories about sword restorers, sword polishers, in the days long ago before battles, giving the swords a little touch up on the sharp edge. I don't think they were too worried about the aesthetics then, though, because if you need something to save your life, your second consideration is how pretty it is. So they know they don't stay sharp forever. They will dull, especially with use, just like anything else. And the other myth is they won't chip or break or bend. Nope, they'll do all those things. Chip, break, bend, and that's when forging flaws usually come out, is through use. So if you didn't see the forging flaw before, when you actually go to use it, and you could see it then, and it could show up in a bad way, and it happened. And it's kind of like a paradox. The harder the edge is, the more it's able to keep an edge, but it's also more brittle. So you could see a sword that looks beautiful, but it's got a whole bunch of these chips, and now in order to reshape it, the whole side, or the whole sword has to be brought down to the cutting edge. And I'll go over that in a little bit. But yes, they did break, chip, bend. There's some inherent flexibility in the design and the forging process of the swords, but they could also bend, and then sometimes the bends could come out and sometimes they couldn't. Again, before the modern era, really, and especially before the Edo period, these were weapons of war. They're meant to look as attractive as possible, of course, especially, for people who had more money. But ultimately, it's like a spear or a gun. It's if you need this thing to save your life and to be actually useful. So another one is that they were always used by samurai. No, you could have a longer sword that in the later era, in the Edo era, would have fit what only a samurai was allowed to wear, but perhaps it was made before 1588. In 1588 was Hideyoshi's famous or infamous sword hunt, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And he was attempting to unify or take over Japan. And part of it was he figured, well, if the common people don't have weapons, or the fewer weapons they have, the better. And not to make a political statement here, but it's easier to rule a people if they're unarmed. So the idea was that there was supposed to be a giant statue of the Buddha made out of these collected swords. I don't think that ever happened. I don't know that that ever happened, but it was just a pretense for taking all swords from people who weren't samurai. But before that, you could be a farmer or merchant and own a long sword, whatever you could afford. You couldn't always carry it around places, being that you spent your entire day working anyway. I don't know if you'd want to or could carry it around with you all the time anyway. But you can at least own it prior to 1588, like I said. And the other thing is, I have here blood grooves. Those blood grooves in the sword. I think whether it's Japanese or European or any other sword, there's no such thing as blood grooves. Oh, that's where the blood can go. Now, that's ridiculous. It's to lighten the blade. Because if you're going to be wielding something made of steel, as anybody who's chopped wood knows, that tool gets a little heavy after a while. If a battle was going to last a few seconds, yeah, it probably wouldn't matter as much how much your blade weighed. Weight is an important consideration when you're in a battle that lasts like hours or a day or days. If it's something you're swinging around all the time, you're going to want it to be as light and still as effective as possible. And the Japanese found that, one groove, or parallel grooves, or sometimes even a design into the blade. It looks nice and it gets rid of material. But that gets to the other point, is a lot of the designs in blades, the bunji, the hormono, that were carved, chiseled, were often used to hide flaws. Like if you had an opening in the blade, put a little, carving in there, and this guy, now you can't really see the opening. So, but that was more for later years, Edo period, times of peace, where things were done for ornamentation, carvings in the blade. Before that, it was really just to make for a lighter but still effective weapon. Brings to the other point. Is that the swords said to be the soul of the samurai. But for the longest time, they were a secondary weapon. Maybe a tertiary weapon. They weren't the primary weapon. It wasn't practical. I mean, samurai were brave, and the soldiers, whether it was an Ashigaru foot soldier or whoever, or some kind of farmer soldier, way back. They were brave and noble, of course, and sometimes unafraid to die. But they weren't looking to die. So they weren't stupid either. They knew that it was better to fight or kill from a distance. That's true still today. Why risk your life close up when you can kill somebody from a distance? That's why the primary weapon was always a bow and arrow. If I could kill somebody and, from way far away, and there's a chance they may not be able to get to me, that's a better and more practical idea. So the samurai often practiced archery. That was a regular thing, and that was more important than the sword. Not to say that the sword wasn't also carried or some kind of bladed weapon, but if you could practice and get good with a bow, you could put other people in danger without them being in reach to put you in danger. It wasn't really until the Edo period and more times of peace and sword schools started to develop that you had the ability and the freedom to turn something that used to be practical into an art. You had the time and the resources to be able to do that. The other thing I have here, this is funny, ninja swords. Oh man, this is crazy. No ninja swords. No, sorry, it's a bursty bubble there. No. I mean, there were ninja, yes, especially the ninja of Iga Prefecture in Japan. They were famous or infamous. But their job was not to look fancy or, cool. Their job was not to look cool. Their job was to use whatever got the job done. They were basically like for hire hitmen. and it'd be a little suspicious if you were caught or observed. Have this ninja sword and be wearing all this and have all sorts of things on you. Be a little suspicious. Which one is the ninja? Who could be a ninja here? Is it the guy with the straight blade sword like we often see? Ninja swords are, yeah, it's probably him. No, they would use whatever weapons or means they could. Poison, tanto, knife, spear tip, smothering, a rope, whatever. It usually wasn't a sword, and the swords weren't like blackened out. There was no need, especially if you keep some blade concealed and you're fast, or if you're like some of the ninja sects and you didn't mind. It's not that you didn't mind, it's just that after the kill, your assigned kill, you were going to be resigned to death or kill yourself anyway. Then I guess it really wouldn't matter if you were observed after the fact or during the fact. If you knew you could get your job done. But no, the ninja swords, the specialized compartments, that's a 20th century invention. Maybe the legend came about because some of the Kanbun era in the Edo period blades were straighter because they emulated the styles of fencing at the time with the shinai. So they were straighter, but if ninja were to use swords, they would use like a regular Japanese sword. Maybe with, blacker fittings, but not something that's totally blacked out that looks suspicious because, God forbid, you're trying to disguise yourself as a ninja and somebody sees it in your home or you're found with it. It looks a little suspicious. It would be like a mafia hitman having, mafia written on the gun. No, it's just going to be a regular gun. They're going to be like property of Vito Corleone. So, next point is, another myth is what you see in museums is how it was. I have that written down here. Like, no, what you're seeing in museums, of course, are the best examples that they could come up with. They're, the most important, best, usually in the best condition. And that wasn't all samurai swords. I know you look at like samurai Japanese swords in museums and think, oh man, look at that. That looks so good. The fittings look so nice and the blades are in such great shape. And look at that state of polish. And that's because they're polished to modern methods, which have been refined over many hundreds of years. And it's at like peak, fineness. And the fittings are usually like better Goto school quality fittings, and they're not going to show blades in museums as obvious forging flaws and faults and so, but the truth is, even during the times of peace, Edo period, most samurai were just getting by. It was only a few that had money. It was a society in which you had a very few at the top with a lot of money. It was like most societies, until the modern era, or, maybe we're going that way again. But, a few people with money, and then the rest of the people, no matter if they were samurai, merchant, farmer, you didn't have a lot of money, and you had to borrow sometimes just to get by. And they would, hold on to the sword sometimes and just forego eating for a little bit. So, that being said, a lot of samurai did not have the finest swords. They had whatever they could afford. And that included some very humble fittings and blades that would be passed down from generation to generation and reused, or sometimes sold out of desperate poverty and then repurchased when and if you could. So they weren't all of the same quality at all, and most were not of any fantastic quality or by these great recognized smiths. Those are usually swords reserved for, the daimyo, or those are the regional rulers in Japan, or members of the bakufu, the shogunate government, or the shogun himself. Um, the other next point is, I can I wrote down I can cut through things with this. Please don't, because it's just like any other weapon. They're great. They have a mystique. Japanese swords, samurai swords. I use the term interchangeably, but you know what I told you about the history. I can cut through things with this, like I can cut through bamboo. Only only if you know how, and B, please don't destroy an antique. Like I said, they're just like any other weapons. The more you use it, the more it's going to wear out, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. Same thing with, like an axe or a gun. The more you use it, the more it's going to wear out. You're going to have to at least replace parts, or it could break altogether from use and just not be usable again. So they were meant to open up live human flesh. Even then, sometimes cutting through bodies or bones, they would chip or bend or break. So that was a risk you took. But when you really needed something to protect your life, you're willing to take a chance. But unless you have a Japanese samurai sword, especially something you spend money on, and like you need it to save your life, all right, maybe you've got to cut things with it at that point. But if you're collecting for art value's sake, don't do that. You could buy like for $500-$600 these Japanese swords made in China or whatever, and that'll cut through stuff, and if it breaks, so what? They're making like 1,000 of them a day. But they won't, especially if a sword is old and it hasn't been repolished in a little bit, it might not really cut through much. And that doesn't mean the art of cutting. Yes, it is an art to cutting. You need to come down or hit specific angles and pull a certain way through the cut. There's a lot more to it than that, but it is a whole thing. You can look that up on YouTube or wherever. The next point is, people say, "Oh, I can find a legend. Maybe I found like a legendary samurai sword that was, 1,000 years old." No, probably not. No, for several reasons, and I'll tell you. Is the first point makes sense. You're not gonna. The chances of you finding a legendary sword are just as slim as you finding a legendary anything that's really old, or a legendary, any weapon like a gun, sword, knife, or even like a painting or whatever. Because the older some things are, the more rare they are, because there have been examples lost to damage, natural disasters, theft, whatever, over the years. So there's the rarity factor. And, the other point is, I was going to do A, 2, and D. Two, the next factor is some people know exactly what these things are and what they're worth, and they've gone looking. And sometimes there are people with maybe bigger wallets, checkbooks, or whatever than you. For example, during the 70s, and my father had a sensei from Japan during the 70s who did this. There's a lot of Japanese who came over when the economy really started to boom and improve, really from like 60s into 70s, 80s, who came from Japan to here, recognized these swords, because they knew what they were looking for. They speak the language, they know the history, and they bought them up. They knew what they were looking for. They bought them from Americans over here who really didn't know what the heck they were. They were war souvenirs. So the Japanese, buyers came over here and really scooped up a lot of those over the years. Anything really important or conceivably valuable. And this brings me to the legend of the Hanjo Masamune. Some people might have heard of that. Oh, the Hanjo Masamune sword. It might still be out there in Japan. And that's a legend that says that one of the important swords in the emperor's collection, the sword made by Masamune, the most famous swordsmith in Japanese history, was surrendered to American GIs at the end of World War II, and it got lost in the system. But I, I personally think that sword is somewhere in Japan. Still, it's the whole thing is like a legend, and I mean the sword does exist, or did exist, or does exist somewhere, but the chance of anybody, finding it, or it wasn't too long after that edict was issued to surrender swords in Japan that the Japanese petitioned the occupying government to allow them to keep, art swords and swords of important historical value. And although it was a directive and the Japanese are seen as rule followers, that rule wasn't always followed, as indicated by the examples of Japanese military swords that I see offered for sale from Japan even until now that were supposed to have been destroyed or surrendered many years ago. So, and they're not all in terrible shape either. So, I'd say most were surrendered, but sometimes I wouldn't put it past some of the Japanese, especially if you had money or were important, or maybe you're from, the emperor's household, to kind of put some of the important swords aside and be like, well, maybe that never existed. I don't know what you're talking about. And it's not like the Americans knew what to come looking for. They didn't have a directory of what important swords were where. They didn't care. They were all stacked up in this arsenal in Tokyo by these American GIs who'd maybe never even seen a Japanese sword before. So it was just a general order to surrender all weapons. All right, well, that's about it, but I will show you some examples now of several swords that I spoke about, and this is indicative of a slightly more ornate, longer Japanese sword. It's a gold foil under lacquer, and this is horn, the saya, the karikata, the knob. Hold up as long as I can there. This is really indicative, too, of the way a lot of the fittings would look in the Edo period, especially later Edo period, especially around Edo, seat of government. It was kind of seen in bad taste to wear anything too garish or outlandish at that time. Maybe in earlier times, you could have scabbards that are crimson red or multicolored or whatever, but not anything. It wasn't French or Italian taste. It wasn't like that. It was still subdued, but in the later Edo period, where most of these swords are still left from, they tended to be even more subdued, as what you see here. The beauty's in the detail. It wasn't like this thing that pops out at you from 30 feet away. You're like, oh wow, look at that. No, you had to get close. Again, we'll open this carefully. And I got to bring up this point again because it drives me crazy. I see in some other sword videos, people show even genuine swords, and they're ripping it out of the scabbard sideways, or please don't do that. There's no need for that. What the heck? Glide it along the mune. Here. Not press, glide, and be very careful when the tip comes out. Rest the scabbard down gently. And I have, of course, a tissue. Another rule is don't touch it with your bare hands. I have seen and heard of reports and things posted online about these guys. They write in and they say, oh man, fingerprints on my blade. I guess I got fingerprints on the blade. How do I get the fingerprints off now? Well, the time to get the fingerprints off is to just never do it to begin with. And if those fingerprints have been on there for weeks or months and now they're acid etched into the blade, good luck. So just don't get fingerprints on there to begin with. Support, try to touch only the mune, the back, with a non-treated tissue. And I'll try to show as much of the detail and beauty of this sword as I can. Has an interesting, vibrant temper line, and this sword was also shortened, but I think it was not terribly old when it was shortened. Many of the swords carried in the Edo period, especially the later Edo period, weren't used. So a lot of times they were never used because a lot of samurai at that point had become mid or low level bureaucrats. Really, it was a time of peace, so the samurai still received a stipend. They were still expected to practice their martial ways, but there weren't actual like combat or wars. So maybe they get into some fights with each other or duels or something, but for the most part, the swords had to just be carried as a rank of office. So you didn't need this enormous sword for battle, and if you could afford it, a lot of them would have, swords from earlier times that maybe they received as family heirlooms or were passed down for generations. They would have them shortened, so as to fit their physique or maybe even their job. Again, they were seen as a rank of office, and you just needed something you could wear on the regular without having to constantly adjust it. It was a pain. So I think this was probably one of those swords, although it's still rather sharp and useful. And the next sword I'm going to show you, I've only brought two this time, sorry. The next sword I'll show you is a sword in the shirasaya. A lot of blades, when not carried in actual mounts, if they were seen as still being important, usable, valuable, you would have a shirasaya made. That's just a plain saya, like this. It's called a saya, a resting scabbard, where you couldn't and wouldn't want to just leave the sword out in the elements. You weren't going to put like a steel blade and just be like, all right, let's throw that in the corner. Put that under the house. No, it's still, valuable and worth keeping around. So they would store them in shirasaya. And this is a blade with a silver foil habaki. This is more of a straight saguha. Temper line, a little different than the previous sword. The previous sword I just showed you had more of a decorative, flamboyant hamon. This one, less so, more straight. I'll try to show as much detail as I can. Again, it's a straight hamon with... There is detail in the hamon. It's just difficult to show here. One of these days I'm going to figure out how to do that a little better. I'm sorry. And this blade has also been shortened. I'm not sure of the age and era of this blade, but again, it's I think it's rather nice. And here's the other side. Again, as best I can. No, I'm not going to rub the tissue against the edge. I think that would be a bad idea. And you see, it's not absolutely perfect. There is an opening up there, but it doesn't go into the boshi, the temper in the point. Everything is still evident. It's still there. All right, well, that's it for this video. I will make another video as soon as I can, and I hope you weren't too disappointed hearing about these, myths, half-truths, and legends. But any further questions, comments, concerns, whatever, just leave a comment, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.